David Holloway never imagined his search for truth would lead to a brutal execution. Tom, the librarian who had once been his ally, stood silently by as the men in black suits tightened their grip, sealing David's fate. He had uncovered the darkest secrets of Ashford, but in doing so, he had broken the one rule no one dared to defy: never ask questions. As the walls of the warehouse closed in, David realized too late that some truths are far too dangerous to discover. Ashford was the kind of town that seemed to belong to another era. Quiet, picturesque, and entirely untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Nestled in a secluded valley, its cobblestone streets wound through rows of charming cottages, each one more inviting than the last. On a lazy afternoon, the town square was filled with the gentle hum of locals going about their daily routines, their lives as predictable as the changing seasons. For an outsider, it might have seemed like the perfect place to escape the noise and turmoil of modern life, but behind the facade of peace, there was a deeper current that few ever noticed. David Holloway had been one of those outsiders. He wasn't from Ashford. He came here for a fresh start, looking to leave behind the mess of his past. A few years ago, he'd lost everything: his job, his relationship, even his will to keep fighting. Ashford offered him the chance to rebuild. The pace of life was slower, the people more reserved, but in the quiet, he thought he could finally heal. At first, things were just as he expected. He rented a small house on the edge of town, a place surrounded by overgrown hedges and tall oak trees that kept the world at bay. He spent his days walking along the riverbank, reflecting on what had gone wrong in his life, and his nights reading old books or watching the stars from his porch. In a way, Ashford had offered him the solitude he needed. But soon, David began to notice things that didn't quite add up. There were certain unspoken rules that seemed to govern the town. People moved in patterns that didn't make sense to him. He saw the same faces at the local diner every day, sitting in silence, as if they were waiting for something. Strangers never stayed long, and newcomers were always treated with polite but distant curiosity. It was as if Ashford had a life of its own, one that didn't welcome outsiders unless they were willing to conform. David didn't know it yet, but he had already broken one of the town's unspoken rules, simply by questioning the way things were. As David settled into the rhythm of life in Ashford, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the peacefulness of the town that bothered him. If anything, that was a welcome change, but rather the underlying tension that seemed to permeate everything. The longer he stayed, the more he noticed that there was a strange uniformity to the people here, a sameness in their behavior that he couldn't quite place. It was as if they were all following some invisible script. There were no protests, no arguments, no real conflict. People went about their business with an eerie calm, but there was something unsettling in their eyes, a quiet, unspoken understanding that whatever was going on in Ashford, it was better to not ask questions. It wasn't long before David realized that something far more powerful than simple town politics was shaping the way everyone lived. He began to pick up whispers in passing conversations. At first, they were subtle. A glance exchanged between two townsfolk when his name was mentioned, a nervous laugh that followed an innocuous question, but as David paid closer attention, the whispers grew louder, and the pattern became undeniable. The local businesses, the town's leaders, and even the police seemed to be connected in ways that didn't make sense. There was a network, an unspoken hierarchy, but no one talked about it openly. One evening, while sitting at the town's small library, David overheard a conversation between two older men who had always seemed to take a special interest in him. They were speaking in hushed tones, but their words still carried an unsettling weight. They talked about keeping things in order, about not letting certain things get out of hand, and there was a clear implication that Ashford's tranquility was maintained through more than just good fortune. David's curiosity deepened, but so did his fear. The town wasn't just controlled, it was managed, and whoever was in charge of that management did not tolerate questions. He couldn't help himself. The urge to know the truth grew stronger with every passing day. What exactly was happening behind closed doors in Ashford? What was the price of peace? David's obsession with uncovering the truth grew as the days passed, and with it, a growing sense of unease. He spent more and more time wandering the town, looking for answers in the places people avoided. His usual walks along the riverbank became excursions into the deeper corners of Ashford, old alleys, abandoned buildings, and areas that weren't in any guidebooks. It was during one of these solitary explorations that he stumbled upon a hidden room in the town's library, tucked away behind a row of dusty bookshelves. The room was small and unremarkable, at least at first glance. It had the musty smell of old paper and neglect. But as David sifted through a stack of forgotten files, he uncovered something that would change everything. Beneath a pile of weathered books, he found a set of documents, thick with layers of government reports, names of local officials, and dates stretching back decades. The documents looked like ordinary town records, but something about the way they were organized set his heart racing. They were meticulously detailed, listing not only financial transactions and zoning laws, but also references to strange incidents, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and long-standing contracts between the town's leaders and shadowy figures who were never named. As David flipped through the pages, his hands shook. The deeper he read, the more it became clear that Ashford wasn't just a small, quiet town. It was a place where power was held in secret, where the lives of its citizens were controlled by an unseen hand. There were mentions of a council, a group of people who oversaw everything that happened in the town. They controlled the economy, the police, and even the judiciary. But it was the last document that truly struck him. It detailed a series of killings, victims who had broken the unspoken rules of Ashford, people who had dared to ask too many questions, or worse, challenge the authority of the council. The executions were swift and silent, and the bodies had never been found. The realization hit David like a bolt of lightning. The people running Ashford weren't just influential, they were ruthless. This was no ordinary town. It was a place where life and death were controlled by the whims of a hidden group, and he had just broken the most sacred rule of all, asking too many questions. David's world began to feel like it was closing in on him. The days after he found the documents were filled with a gnawing sense of dread. His every step felt like it was being watched, like there was an invisible force shadowing him, waiting for him to slip up. He tried to ignore the feeling, but it lingered, persistent and unnerving. When he walked into town, he couldn't shake the sense that people weren't just going about their daily routines, they were observing him. He started noticing unfamiliar faces in places where they shouldn't be, lingering a little too long in the corners of shops or sitting just a bit too quietly in the diner. At first, it was easy to dismiss these thoughts as paranoia, but the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just the unfamiliar faces. It was the way they looked at him. There was no hostility, no overt signs of malice. Just an eerie calm, an understanding that he was out of place. The more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. He was no longer an outsider in Ashford. He was noticed, and that meant he was a threat. Something as simple as making eye contact with a stranger felt dangerous now, as if it might expose him. Then one evening, as he walked home from the diner, he saw a black sedan parked across the street from his house. He didn't recognize the car, but the sight of it sent a jolt through him. The next day it was parked there again, and the day after that. At first he tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just any car. It was the same sleek black sedan, always parked at the same angle, always on the same side of the street. Whoever was in that car was watching him. David didn't know who they were, but he was certain they weren't there by chance. Whoever was behind the wheel had a purpose, and it had something to do with him. The deeper he went into uncovering Ashford's secrets, the more dangerous it became. It wasn't just the documents or the strange whispers anymore. It was a presence that was closing in. A presence that wouldn't stop until David was silenced. That night, as he walked into his house, the feeling of being watched never left him. He closed the blinds tightly, locked the doors, and sat in the dark, waiting for the inevitable. It was only a matter of time before they came for him. The night after the black sedan appeared for the third time, David couldn't sleep. The weight of the situation was too much to bear. His thoughts raced, circling the same terrifying idea Over and over again. He had uncovered something dangerous. Something that could cost him everything. The strange feeling of being hunted had settled deep into his bones, and no matter how hard he tried to calm himself, it wouldn't go away. He had tried to reach out to a few of the town's more outspoken residents, but each conversation ended with vague responses and quick excuses to leave. It was as if the entire town had agreed to ignore the truth, and he was the only one willing to look. By the time morning came, David knew he couldn't stay in Ashford much longer. He had to get the documents to someone who could help. Someone who wasn't afraid. He packed up his things, determined to leave. As he prepared to drive out of town, a sudden feeling of dread washed over him. The sedan was gone. He stood at his front door, staring out at the empty street, waiting for a sign that things weren't as bad as they seemed. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew the truth. This was it. This was the point of no return. Just as he reached for his car keys, his phone rang. The number was unlisted, unfamiliar. David hesitated before answering. There was nothing but static. At first, a crackling sound that seemed to buzz in his ear. Then a voice, low and distorted, cut through the static. "You're making a mistake." The word sent a chill down his spine, and he froze, gripping the phone tightly. He had no idea who it was, but the message was clear. Someone knew what he was doing. They knew he had seen something he shouldn't, and they were watching him. David didn't have time to process what that meant. He grabbed his bag and ran out the door, heading straight for his car. But as he reached the driveway, two men in black suits appeared at the end of the street. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge him in any way. They simply walked toward him, their footsteps deliberate and unhurried. David's heart pounded in his chest. It was happening. He was being hunted, just like the others in the documents. He turned to run, but it was too late. One of the men caught his arm, pulling him back with surprising strength. The grip was like iron, and as he was yanked into the alley, David realized with horror that there was no escape. The game had changed. He had crossed the line, and now the price was about to be paid. David's world went black in an instant. The men in black suits moved with terrifying precision, their grip tight as they dragged him through the narrow alley behind his house. He struggled, kicking and twisting, but their hands were unyielding, like they were trained for this very moment. The weight of what was happening hit him like a brick to the chest. He had no control, no way out. The moment he had stepped too far, crossed a line that had been drawn long before he arrived in Ashford, he had sealed his fate. They pushed him into the back of a van, its windows tinted dark enough to block out the world. The doors slammed shut behind him, and for a brief moment, David thought he might be able to escape. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew better. The world outside Ashford was a place he no longer had access to. The town had claimed him, and its grip was far stronger than he ever realized. The ride was silent except for the low hum of the engine, and the air inside the van felt suffocating. David's mind raced, but his body refused to cooperate. He was too scared to think straight. He had no idea where they were taking him, or why they hadn't just killed him on the spot. Maybe it was a message, a warning. Maybe they wanted to break him before they silenced him completely. After what felt like hours, the van came to a stop. The men pulled him out roughly, dragging him into a dark, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. David's eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light. The place smelled of damp concrete and stale air, and the silence was oppressive, almost unnatural. He was shoved into a chair, his arms bound behind him. A cold chill crawled up his spine as he realized just how alone he was. There was no one to help him now, no one to save him from what was coming next. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder, until finally, a figure appeared from the shadows. A man in a suit, his face shadowed. But there was something about his presence that made David's blood run cold. He was no ordinary man. This wasn't just another local enforcer. This was someone higher up. Someone who knew everything about David, everything he had uncovered. David's throat was dry, his mouth tasting of fear. He wanted to speak, to plead, but the words stuck in his throat. Whatever was about to happen, it was already too late. The man approached him slowly, eyes cold and calculating, as if David were nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with. The tension in the air thickened, and David's stomach twisted in knots. He could feel the end coming closer with every passing second. David didn't know how long he sat there, bound and alone, waiting for whatever came next. His head was spinning, and every passing moment felt like it stretched into eternity. The cold concrete beneath him seemed to seep into his bones, making him feel more isolated, more vulnerable. His heart was racing, his thoughts scattered. He couldn't process the full weight of what was happening, not yet. All he knew was that something terrible was on the horizon, something that had been set in motion the moment he decided to uncover Ashford's secrets. The man in the suit had not spoken to him directly. Instead, there was a quiet deliberation in the way he moved, as though he was deciding David's fate with a cold, detached calculation. The shadows in the warehouse seemed to loom larger, as though the very walls were closing in on him. Every time he thought he might be able to escape, his hands would remind him of the reality. They were tied securely behind him, and any attempt to flee would only make things worse. The man stepped closer, his face still obscured by the darkness. David strained against his restraints, trying to get a glimpse of who this person was. But the figure remained a blur, a shadow that could have belonged to anyone. Someone with the power to take his life without a second thought. "Why are you doing this?" David finally managed to croak, his voice hoarse from fear and silence. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for someone out of David's sight, and soon, two more figures emerged from the shadows. They were silent, their movements fluid and purposeful. Without a word, one of them placed a metal tray on a nearby table, and David's stomach lurched as he recognized the objects on it. Tools, crude, intimidating, and clearly not meant for anything other than pain. David tried to remain calm, tried to think of some way out, but his mind refused to cooperate. Panic was starting to set in. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for any of it. The figure in the suit finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "You were warned, David. You should have left when you had the chance." The words cut through the air, sharp and final. The men stepped forward, their presence now fully closing in around him. David's pulse thundered in his ears. It was happening. It was real. Suddenly, the figure in the suit turned and motioned toward the far corner of the warehouse. A door creaked open, and for a brief fleeting moment David thought maybe there was hope. Maybe someone was coming to save him. But as the door swung wide, a lone figure stepped inside, the silhouette unmistakable. His heart sank. The last person he expected to see. It was the librarian, the same person who had been helping him uncover the town's secrets, the very person he thought had been on his side. But there was no kindness in their eyes now, only coldness. They were part of it, after all. David's breath caught in his throat. Whatever hope he had left shattered in that instant. David's mind raced, trying to process the betrayal. The librarian, Tom, he remembered now, had been the one to guide him to the library's hidden room. Tom had been the one to whisper to him in the quietest moments, encouraging him to dig deeper into the town's past. But now, standing in the shadows of the warehouse, Tom's face was devoid of the warmth and camaraderie David had once thought he'd seen. There was no compassion left in him, no empathy for David's predicament. The librarian was no longer the helpful ally he'd once appeared to be. He was another cog in the cold machine that controlled Ashford. The realization hit David hard. Tom wasn't here to save him. He wasn't here to help him escape. He had been a part of the system from the very beginning, just another link in the chain of power that governed Ashford's dark undercurrents. David's stomach churned with disgust. All those late-night conversations, the promises of finding the truth together, they had been lies, calculated lies to keep him digging deeper, to make him believe he could expose the organization. In truth, David had been a pawn the whole time. Tom's eyes never left David as he walked slowly toward him. There was a heavy finality in his step, as if every movement had been rehearsed. When he stopped in front of David, the weight of his silence was suffocating. David could see it now, the coldness in Tom's eyes, the lack of any shred of humanity. This wasn't the same man who had seemed so open, so vulnerable. This was a person who had long ago given up any pretense of morality in favor of loyalty to something far more dangerous. You never understood, did you? Tom's voice was quiet, but it had a cold edge. This isn't about you. This isn't about Ashford. This is about survival. Our survival. The organization isn't just a group of powerful people, David. It's a force that's been around, longer than you can imagine. It protects us. It keeps this town in balance. People like you, you're the ones who upset that balance. David's breath quickened. The enormity of the conspiracy was sinking in. The organization wasn't just a group of people. It was a force, a machine that had been running for generations, shaping Ashford from the shadows. The idea that the entire town was just a cog in a much larger, much older system made his stomach twist in a way he couldn't explain. And now, because he dared to pull back the curtain, he was about to become a casualty. Tom turned away, his figure swallowed by the darkness of the warehouse, and David's mind screamed in protest. There was no escape. No one was coming to save him. The truth he had uncovered would be his undoing. David's heart pounded as the men in black suits closed in around him, the weight of the situation pressing down on him from all sides. His hands were still bound, but the fear flooding his veins made him feel as though every inch of his body was in chains. The room was suffocating, the air thick with the oppressive silence, broken only by the distant sound of his frantic breathing. He had thought, even as he was being dragged into this place, that there was a chance, some slim hope that he could escape, or that someone might intervene. But now, in this cold, dimly lit warehouse, that hope had evaporated completely. The figure in the suit, the one who had been standing so quietly in the corner, stepped forward again. His presence was commanding, and the way he moved suggested that he was someone with a great deal of authority in Ashford's shadowy hierarchy. David wanted to look away, wanted to shut his eyes and deny what was happening, but he couldn't. He was trapped in this nightmare, forced to face the truth of what Ashford had become and what his role in it had turned into. The man in the suit stopped in front of him and looked down, studying David with a mixture of disdain and indifference. "You've learned too much," he said, his voice smooth, almost casual, as if they were talking about nothing more than the weather. "And for that, you've become a liability." David's throat tightened, and he fought to keep his voice steady. I didn't want to cause any trouble. I just wanted to know the truth." The man smiled coldly. "The truth?" he repeated as if the idea were absurd. "There is no truth here, David. Not the kind you're looking for. There's only power, and there's only control. Ashford is not a place for questions, for curiosity. You've crossed a line, and now you'll pay the price." David's chest tightened, his breath shallow. The words sunk deep into his mind like a heavy stone, their meaning crystal clear. There was no place for truth in Ashford, no place for freedom. There was only the rule of the organization, an organization so entrenched, so powerful, that it controlled everything, from the lives of the townspeople to the very future of the place. And he had broken the one rule that kept it all in place, the rule of silence. Tom's figure appeared again in the corner of David's vision, his face still as cold as it had been when he had first arrived. There were no comforting words, no final gestures of kindness, just a blank, emotionless stare. David realized that this was it. This was the moment everything came crashing down. As the men in suits moved to take him, David could only brace himself for what was coming next. The hope for escape, for survival, was gone. All that was left was the bitter reality. The organization had decided his fate, and there was no room for mercy. The end had come. David's final moments were a blur of panic and confusion. The men in suits took no care in how they moved him, their hands like iron, forcing him forward through the dark, cavernous space of the warehouse. He couldn't process the feeling of being utterly powerless, his mind numb with the reality of his situation. The hum of the fluorescent lights above echoed in the cold silence, amplifying his thoughts as they collided in a frantic storm. It was as if the world had stopped for a moment, time frozen, and all he could do was wait for the inevitable. The fear that had once been a distant companion now filled his entire body, threatening to suffocate him, Every breath he took felt heavier, like a weight pressing down on his chest. But in the deep recesses of his mind, a small, stubborn part of him still clung to the hope that somehow, someone might intervene. Maybe someone else in Ashford was just as horrified by what was happening as he was. Maybe it wasn't too late. But the cold reality of the situation sank in deeper with every step they took. The men in suits were not just agents of a corrupt system. They were the enforcers of its absolute control. They were the hands of the organization that had shaped this town for generations, making sure that no one ever dared to step out of line. And now, he was paying the price for his curiosity, his desperate need to know the truth. He had crossed the point of no return. They brought him to a small room at the back of the warehouse, a room bare except for a single harsh light hanging overhead. The walls were covered in grime, the floor stained with old oil and dirt. It was sterile in its emptiness, like a place where decisions were made without remorse, without hesitation. One of the men in suit stood before him, his face unreadable, as the others held him in place. David tried to meet his eyes, but the man never blinked. A silent understanding passed between them, the kind of understanding that had been cultivated through years of maintaining power over others, of extinguishing lives that dared to challenge. David's pulse raced. This was it. He was going to die in this God-forsaken place, a casualty of a system that cared nothing for him or anyone else. The cold metal against his wrists reminded him of his helplessness. But in his final moments, one thought lingered in his mind. Who controls Ashford? Just as the men moved into position, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by hurried footsteps. Someone had broken in. Someone was coming to save him. But as his heart leaped with a flicker of hope, the room plunged into darkness, and all that remained was the terrifying sound of the approaching footsteps, far too slow, far too deliberate to be the salvation he had hoped for. David had crossed the line, and now there was no going back.